Chapter 13. Mr. Nickleby would like to see you in his office, Mrs. Kutcher says to Ben. He wants to see me? Ben asks. What for? I don't know, she says. The secretary just sent me a note asking for you to come to the principal's office. The last bell will ring in a few minutes, so you'd better get your things and hurry down there. Ben walks down the empty hallway, wondering why Mr. Nickleby sent for him. He's never been called to the office for doing anything wrong before. He doesn't like Mr. Nickleby, but not just because he's the principal. Ben can't put his finger on why, but he just doesn't trust him. Think about your own life. Without naming any names, do you have somebody that when you met them, you just felt like you just couldn't trust them? You might be able to make a text-to-self connection with Ben. Could I be in trouble because of my schoolwork? He wonders. He hasn't done his geography report. But Mr. Nickleby couldn't have heard about that. For all Mrs. Kutcher knows, he's been working on the report all along. When he reaches the office, he sees his mom and dad just outside it, sitting in the chairs against the wall. What are they doing here? He gets a sick feeling in his stomach. Before Ben can say anything to his parents, Mr. Nickleby strides out of his office towards them, wearing one of those fake little smiles that adults give kids when they want something out of them. Hello, Ben, Mr. Nickleby says. Why don't you all come on in? Ben looks at his parents for some signs, but their faces don't reveal anything. Come on, champ, his father said, smiling. But his dad's smile isn't very comforting. Something is really wrong. Mr. Nickleby gestures for them to come into his office. As Ben goes by, his mother reaches out and touches his shoulder. Mr. Nickleby drags in a couple of extra chairs so there's a place for each of them to sit. Then he positions himself behind his desk, like it's a fort or something. Take a moment to make a prediction about what you think Mr. Nickleby called Ben to his office for. Ben's mom pulls her chair close to Ben's. What's wrong? Ben wonders. Did something happen to Agatha? Is one of my grandparents sick? Mr. Nickleby leans back a little and folds his hands. Ben, I asked your parents to come in so we could all talk about a couple of things. All of us here together, all right? Sure. Ben's voice isn't much more than a squeak. How are you getting along with the kids in your class? Are you getting used to being here? Sure, Ben says, yeah. Anybody in particular you're having a hard time with? No, not really. He could do without Frankie Murley and his buddies. And Ryan sometimes drives him crazy. But Ben's not about to say anything that would get anybody in trouble. Mr. Nickleby pauses for a moment, scratching the side of his neck. Ben looks at his parents. They're trying to hide it, but he can tell they're upset. Finally, his dad speaks. We've been talking with Mr. Nickleby while we were waiting for you. He'd like to ask you a few questions about Mrs. Tibbets. Okay, says Ben. This doesn't help much. He still can't figure out what's going on. How do you like Mrs. Tibbets? Mr. Nickleby asks. Fine. I like her fine. I hear you've helped around her house a little. Uh-huh, Ben says. Yes, sir. What do you do when you go there? Now Ben is confused. He's sure there's a right answer and a wrong answer, but he can't think of where they might be or where the conversation is headed. It feels like a trap. I helped her in her backyard, and one night she showed me some toads in a little pool. All three adults stare at Ben. Mr. Nickleby breaks the uncomfortable silence with another question. Anything else? No, Ben says, shaking his head. Mr. Nickleby draws in a breath. What about snakes? Did you help her with snakes? No. Did Mrs. Tibbets tell Mr. Nickleby about how he let the snakes out? Is he in trouble for that? Does Mrs. Tibbets have some poisonous snakes? Rattlesnakes, for instance? Ben glances over at his parents. His dad's sitting there, looking like he's trying his best to keep his mouth shut. His mom just looks worried. Couldn't you just ask her? Ben doesn't want to say more until he figures out what is going on. I'll talk to Mrs. Tibbets, but first we'd like to hear your story. Ben, his dad's eyes look tired. Just tell Mr. Nickleby what you know. Well, she did, but they got away. Did she let you help with the snakes? Mr. Nickleby asks. No. Not really. What do you mean, not really? Did she let you go near them? No, she... Well, Ben, Mr. Nickleby interrupts, here's the problem. That's not what you told some other kids. I know, but that was just a story I made up. But we understand that Ryan Brinson said it was true. Suddenly, Ben's dad sits forward. Wait a minute, Mr. Nickleby, we've talked about this already. The snakes got away. Mrs. Tibbets called us and told us. Ben doesn't know anything about it. Ben glances over at his dad. His parents trust him, but they don't know what really happened. I want Ben's side of the story, Mr. Nickleby says. Ryan didn't know anything about it. He was just saying that so the other kids would believe me. He's never even been to our house. Mr. Nickleby leans forward. So you didn't have anything to do with the snakes. Ben looks at his parents. He bows his head. What is it, Ben? His mother asks. What happened, Ben? His father asks. Now they're both concerned. I let them out, Ben whispers. What did you say? Mr. Nickleby says. I didn't hear you. I let them out, Ben says louder. I didn't mean to, but I did. Ben, his mother said. You told us you didn't. I know. I'm sorry. Did Mrs. Tibbets know you opened the cage? Mr. Nickleby asks. No, I didn't tell her. She told me not to touch the cage, but I did, and they got out. Ben, why didn't you tell us? His mom asks. I couldn't. I wanted to, but I couldn't. And then I finally told Mrs. Tibbets the night of the Spadefoots. She wasn't... Mrs. Tibbets should have told you, Mr. Nickleby said to Ben's parents, and she shouldn't have left Ben alone with the snakes. Suddenly, Ben understands. Mr. Nickleby isn't mad at him. He's mad at Mrs. Tibbets. She told me not to. Ben tried to keep his voice under control. I wasn't supposed to go near them. It wasn't her fault. She told me not to go near the snakes, and I did it anyway. All right, says Mr. Nickleby, shifting in his chair. I think I've got a pretty good picture of what happens. No, you don't, Ben protests. Okay, Ben's dad says. He puts his hand on the back of Ben's neck and gives it a gentle squeeze. It's all right, Ben, says Mr. Nickleby. We don't need to talk about this any more right now. He relaxes back into his chair. What about your classes? Any problems there? Ben shakes his head. I hear the 5th graders are doing a big report on ecosystems. How's yours coming? Okay. Ben can't get his mind off the snakes. Why didn't he leave the cage alone? And why did he have to tell stupid Frankie Murley about them? Everybody stands up. Mr. Nickleby extends his hand for Ben to shake. Ben doesn't want to, but he forces himself to put out his hand. The principal's palm is moist with sweat. Will Mrs. Tibbets be okay? Ben asks. We'll see how things work out, Mr. Nickleby says. It really wasn't her fault. I know what you think, Ben. Mr. Nickleby guides him towards the door. Why don't you step outside for a moment and let me talk with your parents for just a minute? Ben waits just outside his office, listening. He can hear Mr. Nickleby's voice, but he can't make out the words. Just as school lets out, Ben grabs his backpack and dashes down the hallway, dodging between the kids pouring out of the classrooms. He runs all the way to Mrs. Tibbets' room. She's not there. Right now I want you to make a prediction. Do you think Mrs. Tibbets is going to get in trouble or not?